Welcome to the National Organization for Rare Disorders webinar on ensuring your board reflects your diverse community. This is our final webinar in our DEI series for rare disease nonprofits. My name is Debbie Drell, and I'm NORD's Director of Membership and your facilitator for this meeting. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a second-generation Mexican-American with both parents born in Mexico. Before we start, I'll just do a quick story. Sometimes I hear rare patients at events or rare parents at events talking about how they had to move thousands of miles away from home to get treatment for their children living with rare life-threatening disease. And it's shocking to hear the lengths these parents must go for access to care, switching jobs, working 2 jobs, selling their home, moving to another state. It is really the sad reality of rare diseases that potentially life-saving specialists, clinics, or clinical trials are located thousands of miles away from home. It takes a lot of resources, privilege, and ability to uproot your entire life to access treatments. I think about my own family, my first-generation immigrant mom who learned English watching Sesame Street and was a single mom to 7 children with little money. She had no strong family support system in the United States and wouldn't have the resources to relocate her entire family. The choices she would have to make: she'd have to take 1 child to a clinic out of state and leave the other 6 children to fend for themselves. My mom could not make this decision. She would not, and it would mean life or death for the child living with a rare disease. This is one of thousands of stories involving limited access to financial resources, involving language barriers, immigration challenges, medical literacy. It's a powerful and necessary perspective to see how diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and the rare disease space can intersect. And I thank you for meeting us at these important crossroads. When it comes to nonprofits, how does diversity of leadership and a board of directors impact the lives of marginalized patients? We'll discuss the benefit of diversifying your board to reflect your community and strategies you can implement to help you recruit and inclusively onboard diverse board members. This webinar, including the entire DEI series, is open and accessible to the community at large to help inspire all nonprofit leaders to take action. This meeting is recorded and will be made available after the webinar. Next slide, please. NORD's mission, as you see here, NORD, an independent nonprofit, is leading the fight to improve the lives of rare disease patients and families. We do this by supporting patients and organizations, accelerating research, providing education, disseminating information, and driving public policy. Leaders of NORD's over 330 member organizations are entitled to all the resources that NORD provides, including state level and federal policy, communications, public awareness, education initiatives, patient assistance programs, natural history registries, and more. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank our sponsors to allowing us to make this educational webinar series and resources available across all of our members and nonprofits and the rare disease community at large. Next slide, please. NORD's membership team is working for you. NORD's mission is your mission. During this call, an issue raised may prompt you to think of a question that doesn't specifically get addressed within this short period of time. Our membership team is always available, as you see the email address on your screen, membership@rarediseases.org. Next slide, please. I have to end this webinar series with a request. If you're not a NORD member organization, but you're leading a rare disease nonprofit, please get in touch with us. Email us at membership@rarediseases.org. We'd love to learn about what you're doing and how we can support you through membership. These are, as you see on the screen before you, some of the invaluable resources. A Facebook group where you can crowdsource your questions and concerns and hear ideas and share resources and find mentors. Thousands of dollars of resources, registrations for conferences, board source membership for helping to manage your board of directors, and reduction in fees for our registry users, and just invaluable connections to our staff, to FDA and other regulators. So we encourage you to join us and to learn more. Next slide. So NORD is doing this DEI webinar series, and we are committed to increasing access and service. If you love this series of webinars, then you will especially appreciate the toolkits that we're building, because this these webinar series is across 3 weeks and a couple of hours collectively. Our toolkits will build on the information that's been covered in the series and provide you with additional resources, worksheets, activities to implement DEI resources. All the webinar recordings will be in these toolkits as well. Next slide, please. And I just mentioned our DEI toolkits, so please sign up for NORD updates and we will let you know when those are released. Next slide, please. So we do have an incredible presentation with 3 panelists. Before I pass the virtual microphone over to Dr. Yolanda Avent, I would like to just mention that we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you didn't attend the first 2 webinars, just want to go over a quick definition of what we mean by DEI. This is taken from the US Food and Drug Administration as well as Ford Foundation. Diversity is defined as the representation of all individual attributes, identities, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, tribe, caste, socioeconomic status, even thinking and communication styles, collectively and individually. We believe that when we prioritize diversity, we are able to help our organizations, our members, and the patient communities we represent pursue their missions and goals more efficiently and effectively. Equity, you may have heard this a lot. It's defined as the fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and equality of access to information and resources for all. This becomes possible when we build an environment rooted in respect and dignity. And it is also possible when we take action to ensure equitable access for all communities in the rare disease space. Finally, inclusion, and that refers to behaviors and actions that create a culture of belonging and a sense of value for all who participate and contribute, while at the same time understanding no one person can or should be asked to represent their entire community. So during our call, or during our webinar rather, we will hear from our speakers. You can use the Q&A function on the Zoom screen to submit questions. We'll try to get to them as we go along in the presentation. We will also have time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome onto the camera colleagues, friends of NORD, incredible researchers, incredible experts, Dr. Yolanda Avent, founder and CEO of Avent Diversity Consulting, who will be followed by Walter L. Douglas Jr., COO of Rutgers University, New Jersey Medical School, and Ashanti De Silva, membership manager working in our membership team, but also very involved with our organizational leaders. So now I am so happy to turn it over to Dr. Avent, and our other speakers will come on camera when they present and when we do Q&A. Thanks so much, Dr. Avent.
Thank you so much, Debbie. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. And so as we think about how we diversify our boards, and next slide, please. My name again is Dr. Yolanda Avent. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I do prefer my name. And I'll just share with you some information about me and my primary identities. I identify as a Black woman, which is very uniquely tied to me. I'm a mother of a 10-year-old daughter who is on the autism spectrum. I am a learner, and I also am an old school hip hop enthusiast. One of my favorite quotes is, "We must always take sides, because neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." So just a little bit about me. One thing about DEI when it comes to telling your story is that it's important that you invest in what your story is going to be, because whether you tell it or not, someone's going to write it. So why not be an author of your own story and invest in that? And that's the same thing when it comes to the story of your board and the story of your organization. Next slide. So let's start with some statistics about nonprofit boards. So this was a study that was conducted with over 1,500 nonprofit CEOs and over 409 board chairs. And so as of this, and when the study was conducted, there were 78.6% white in terms of the boards. And then as you can see, it goes down significantly from that point with 7.5% African American, 4.2% Latinx, Latino, Hispanic American, and then 2.6% Asian, Pacific Islander, Asian American. So when we think about diversity, race is obviously one of the characteristics or the components when it comes to diversity. And then we think about who's being included when it comes to boards and what that impact of that diversity looks like. And so the numbers speak for themselves. So let's talk a little bit more about why this is really important. Next slide. So why should you invest in IDEA? And when I say IDEA, it's really some of the same terms you've heard before. It's just another way of saying DEI. It's inclusion, diversity, equity, and the A is for accessibility. So how are people having access to your organization? So when nonprofit boards reflect the diversity of their community, you're really investing not only in your community, but you're investing in yourself. Your organization will be better able to access resources for the community through your connections, whether that's with collaborative partners, coalition building, or potential donors. You're also able to better meet maybe an unmet need that you may not even be connected to or know about because you have limitations within your board based on your networks or your representation. A diverse board will also help improve your nonprofit's ability to respond to those external influences that are constantly changing. How you even set up your nonprofit's communication can be very important in how you address and provide outreach to the communities that you're trying to serve. How do they see themselves in the communication that you're putting out there? And again, how are you going to best engage with those communities? And so that's really important. Next slide. So as you see from this graphic, it says, frankly, Denzel, we like the look of you. Well, why is that? That's affinity bias. We tend to have more praise, right, and rewards and more trust in people who are from identity groups that mirror our own. And so that's one of many different types of bias. So I talk about this because one of my research areas is implicit bias. And so understanding the impact that that can have when you're recommending people for your boards and when you're thinking about assessing your networks, think about how implicit bias can impact that. Because if we're continuing to just suggest people who look like us, then that's going to be part of your narrative and part of the story of how your board is created and will continue to have some limitations. So the first barrier to inclusion is affinity bias because we tend to favor people who look like us or come from similar groups. So interrupting that bias and figuring out ways to do that is going to be really important. Next slide. So here are some best practices that I would suggest. When you're thinking about embedding DEI or IDEA into your board requirements, require your board to think about meaningful reasons for selecting diverse talent and not just thinking about on the front end who you want and what identities are you missing, but how are you going to also retain those board members once they get there, which is equally important because you don't want to have a culture and climate where you have people now come to your board where maybe limited diversity, but then they don't stay. Right, so having conversations about what do microaggressions in leadership look like? What do those things look like from a different perspective? So thinking about all those things and that retention is going to be really important. Provide a vision for what you're actually looking for. That can be really helpful with coalition building and getting best practices for other people who have found ways to diversify their boards in meaningful and intentional ways. Broaden your professional circles. That requires you to tap into different networks outside of maybe your current networks. Reaching out to professional organizations, asking people to consult with you around different issues, creating advisory boards to your board. So there's lots of different ways to do that. So thinking again of how you create your circle and increasing those networks. Tokenism. Have to go beyond that. The symbolism requires that we update our thinking, right? Not just thinking, hey, we are missing this one particular identity and we need to get that person, but what is the impact and the need? So I highly suggest you do a needs assessment of your organization and think about what is the need, what is the impact, what is the community need? And then again, as I go back, what is retention going to look like? What does it look like to set someone up for success once they're on your board? So again, more thinking about how that person can be successful and how you mutually can co-create an environment to give them agency to be successful once they're there. So you got to start somewhere. And sometimes that may look like tokenism, but once you start, your intent and your impact are going to have to work hand in hand. So be intentional about what you're doing, and your impact is going to be something that's going to be authentic and help your board grow. So in closing, for me, what I would say is, when you think about boards, and I think about boards that I've been on, it's really important that you all have these conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and allow space for people to have those conversations, because you don't want it to become the elephant in the room. Because when microaggressions happen and implicit bias shows up, because we all have implicit bias, you don't want that to create a space of silence and these things not happening and those discussions are not taking place. So have the discussions. It may not be easy, it may be difficult, but those are some of the best conversations. And so growth takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. So thank you so much. And now I will pass it off to Walter L. Douglas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Avent, and thank you, Nord, for having me today. There's nothing more important in today's communication in today's society than conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Allow me to reintroduce myself. I am Walter Douglas Jr. I serve as the Chief Operating Officer at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. Why that's important is that there are only 172 accredited medical schools across the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico, and I am literally maybe one of 3 African Americans who serves in this role. So whether it's in my volunteer work or my professional work, I'm often representing a group or underrepresented minority in the room. Next slide, please. Dr. Avent's done a great job of providing an overview and a lot of substantive reasons for DEI and its value in your organizations and on your boards. So allow me to give you my view based on a board member of many organizations. As you can see on the screen before you, I've served or am currently serving on a variety of boards, the YMCA of Montclair, Neighborhood Healthcare Services, which is a fairly qualified healthcare center, Covenant House of New Jersey. Covenant House is for runaway and displaced youth, and the United Way of Essex in West Hudson County. And there's an asterisk by that particular organization because I never actually made it to their board of directors, but I did serve as chair of their resource and investment committee. And that is important because committee participation is often a great way to identify future board members and to give individuals who you're trying to target for your boards to come involved with your organization. Next slide, please. The role of DEI in the board candidate. When you think about, and when I've thought about boards I've been invited to participate on, I've looked at the composition of the board and I wondered what my role was going to be. And simply put, the role has to be for the DEI candidate like every other candidate, which is to help the organization meet the missions and goals and objectives. If you recruit a board member that is unable to assist in meeting the mission's goals, you've done your organization disservice as well as that volunteer. A DEI candidate, as I've been and am often, represents the interests of an underrepresented community, as Dr. Avent mentioned. But the important piece of that is that that individual is just one voice. And while they have to champion a community, they also have to give balance and objective insight to the needs of both your organization and the community that's underrepresented, oftentimes going beyond themselves to seek additional input from members of their community. This is a role that I like next, and that's to be a role model and ambassador for future board recruits of members of disenfranchised groups. Many times, underrepresented individuals don't participate on boards or in organizations because they feel like their voice will not be heard. And I believe it's important that not only do I represent the interests of the group or the board that I serve on, but I also represent the interests of the population of which I'm a part of. And lastly, but most importantly, continue to advocate for DEI representation in the C-suite of the organization. Board of directors are often responsible, if not primarily responsible, for the recruiting of presidents and CEOs of organizations. As such, they often tend to recruit people like themselves. Dr. Avon shared with us earlier what implicit and affinity bias looks like. And that is often reflected in the presidents of these organizations and the CEOs and C-suite members of these organizations. As a member of an underrepresented group, it's also my responsibility to help advocate, champion, and also press for the recruitment of high caliber underrepresented minorities, underrepresented groups to serve in the C-suite and leadership roles in these organizations. Next slide, please. So how do you recruit and retain a diverse board? When I think about how I was recruited, each organization that recruited me was intentional, and they were very transparent and upfront and said to me very directly, Walter, we don't have a straight male. We don't have an African-American male. We don't have someone in your age cohort. These things are very important because people want to know that there's sincerity in why you want them to be there, not just you need them there to check a box. But checking the box is important. So you make sure you can begin to have representation of all the groups that will lead to greater success in your organization. But once you check the box, you have to get beyond the box. When you look at the individuals you're recruiting, you have to recruit people based on their talent, their time, and their treasure. It's very important if you're going to achieve the missions, goals, and objectives of your organization that someone has a talent to contribute greatly. And that talent may be in a technical area, it may be in a qualitative area, it may just be in representing their community. But that's so important. Does the individual have time? Many boards say, oh yes, we have a very diverse board, but when you look at the board attendance, sometimes the diversity is lacking because diverse candidates are often chosen to participate in many arenas and many boards. So does that individual have the time? And lastly, I would like to say treasure. Many of our organizations are not-for-profits. You need to do fundraising, and sometimes treasure is not the ability of an individual to give of their own wealth or resources, but their ability to help you raise money. And that's just very important to the running of a board. There's a very popular phrase, no money, no mission. And so when you're recruiting individuals for your board, help them understand how they can fill in one of these three important T's. The other thing that I found to be most rewarding as a volunteer is I've been developed as a professional. There have been board trainings, there have been individual trainings that the organizations have invited me to not learn more, not to just learn more about the services they provide and how they provide those services, but other things such as leadership skills, community building skills, and other important resources that allow me to be a better professional as well as a better volunteer. Cultivate and appreciate. There's nothing better than being told thank you for your time. In my life, I've been a fundraiser, and one of my keys to success was you could never say thank you enough. You could never say thank you enough. And especially if a person feels like they're carrying the weight of the entire community on their shoulders in a very important arena, such as your board, they need to feel appreciated by the leadership of the organization as well as their fellow board members. Next slide, please. Now, there are absolutely some obstacles and barriers to being on boards that make people not want to return or continue to participate. Isolation is one of them. It is very important that new board members, regardless of their background, regardless of their affinity, not feel isolated, that they are not only interacted with by the board chair or by the CEO or president, but by all members of the board of which they participate. Linear thinking and fear of innovation. Oftentimes, when you invite somebody new to the board who may be different or appear to be different from the rest of your existing board members, there are going to be ideas that are going to be new, different, and maybe even appear to be strange. But those ideas lead to innovation and can help you improve your service delivery of your organizations. Limited roles and responsibilities. Again, it's always important to actively engage individuals who you recruit to sit on your boards and to have them not only participate in a committee that appears to be within their portfolio of knowledge, but also in other groups. So if you hire someone, or rather hire, if you recruit someone because of their relationship to the community, don't just have them on the community development committee, have them on the finance committee, have them on the capital planning committee, have them on the fundraising committee. But because if you, that leads back to isolation. If all you do is let me do the one thing that I can do, which I may enjoy doing, but I am limited because I'm only going to be exposed to people who are just like me or have skills like my own. And so again, it's really great to encourage people, and it goes back to my previous comment about cultivating and developing. You know, allow people to come and grow as individuals on your boards. Next slide, please. Wash, rinse, repeat. Do the right thing and make it a habit. One and done is a recipe for DEI failure. When we are in a heightened sense of awareness of DEI challenges in our society, we tend to do a lot of work. It becomes an urgency, it becomes an immediate thing. But you can't just do it once and think that you've done it all. You have to continue to cultivate an attitude of recruiting individuals of diverse backgrounds to work on your board. Change for progress, not because of guilt. You have to consider that the change is challenging for everyone. And it's important that people understand that you're changing for the betterment of the organization, not because somebody feels bad about what happened, what they did or didn't do, or what their predecessors may not have done. So change for progress. Last, live your organization's mission in every aspect of what you do, not just service delivery. The care, compassion, empathy that you have for the audience that you serve, have it for your board, your employees, and the staff of your organization. And then make sure that the diverse concept, the DEI concepts, are part of everything that you do, not just in the recruitment of board members or the service you provide to your colleagues, as well as the community you serve. Thank you so much, and I hope that this has been very helpful. And I welcome any thoughts or questions you might have, because I'm still learning, as we all are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. That was a really incredible presentation. We're going to hold off on questions until the very end, but in the meantime, I'd like to welcome Ashanti De Silva as our last speaker to talk a little bit more about board diversity and inclusion from a member organization perspective. Ashanti, thanks for joining. And you're muted.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Debbie. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashanti De Silva. I have the privilege of working alongside NOR's membership team to support rare disease nonprofit organizations. And I am passionate personally about patient advocacy and support, exploring the world when there's not a global pandemic, eating extremely spicy foods, and being a lifelong learner. And it's a real privilege to be here and present with Yolanda and Walter on why it's important to work towards your board reflecting your community. Next slide, please. So I'd like to take some time to discuss what you can do before you begin onboarding to ensure it's as smooth of a process for everyone involved. So say you've taken the steps to recruit from diverse avenues, you've taken some strategies from Yolanda and Walter, and you found some ideal candidates who bring new perspectives and hopefully needed skill sets to your board of directors. And hopefully before this, while you were recruiting, before that, you were considering your organizational values. But if not, this is also a really great point to reflect on your organizational values and your culture before onboarding new members. It's another opportunity to ensure you're conveying your values as a group to new members. And if you're unsure of what that is, organizational values are different from your mission statement. Your mission communicates what you do. Your organizational values Help guide your staff, your board, and leadership in how you're going to do that work, right? How you're going to achieve it. How do you want the world to see your organization? What are the guiding principles and ideals that you will not compromise on? And what are the behaviors that you're encouraging that lead to engagement and empowerment? And for a lot of nonprofits, you can use values like respect, courage, inclusiveness, ethics, equality, and collaboration. So if you don't have an organizational value statement, it's really a best practice to create one collaboratively with your board and even your staff, and have this visible on your site. This helps tremendously with communicating. It helps ensure that the people you're bringing in align with your values and will feel comfortable in your work culture, and really lessens the amount of turnover your board or staff will experience. It also helps to strengthen your donor base, as people will see what you stand for as an organization. So just briefly, I've referenced one of our NORD members, the Necrotizing Enterocolitis Society, the NEC Society, their image here, and because they've done such a great job of including their values in their Who We Are statement, as well as building onto this to really create an inclusivity policy that's visible on their site with this image they've created with such a powerful quote. It's not enough to be quietly anti-racist. Now is the time to be vocally anti-racist. So to build on this, when you're building your organizational values, and you may want to put some images there, this image is powerful because it stands alongside their Who We Are statement, right? I think we've all seen in the past year or two, organizations and companies may just share an image with a quote, and that comes across quite inauthentically. So when you take an image like this and you pair it alongside Who We Are statement or your organizational values, it really shows your commitment to inclusivity and equity. And then this really becomes, a powerful way to show yourself to the rest of the community and the world. Next slide, please. So nonprofits investing time and resources to inclusively welcome new board members really reap the benefits over time. This is so true. New board members can hit the ground running because they're going to have a solid understanding of how the board functions and their specific role in the work being done. This is also a proactive way to really create an environment that encourages openness, inquisitiveness, collaboration, and respect. To reference what Dr. Avent mentioned earlier in regards to the lack of board diversity, BoardSource recently published a Leading with Intent report that showed not only how white most boards are, but also how there's incredible need for diverse age, gender identity, and disability representation. So less than 1% of those interviewed identified as non-cisgender, only 4% of board members were less than 35 years old, and only 5% identified as being disabled. So as you're working toward diversifying your board, these onboarding steps become even more critical, since so many have been left out and overlooked for opportunities in board leadership. This again is another chance to reflect on your values and be as inclusive as possible when you're doing this. So while everyone's time is limited, and I know this is especially true for rare disease nonprofits, so many of you are out there leading organizations as caregivers, people living with rare diseases, maybe both, people with full-time jobs and no paid staff. However, I would still encourage you to take the time to reach out to your new board members and schedule even a 15-minute call before they're introduced to your board. This is an opportunity for them to ask any questions they may have and really get to know you a bit. And I would say this is especially important if you're bringing on first-timers who have not previously served on a board or they aren't familiar with rare diseases. Anything that you can do to increase understanding, levels of comfort, and even break down potential communication barriers is important. This can include practices like asking a person's preferred pronouns, if that's something your organizational culture currently supports and your new member would like to share. So when people feel, like Walter said, when people feel they can show up fully as themselves without being judged, they will be able to achieve their highest potential in your board. So, given this, I encourage you, for any new board members, celebrate and spotlight them. Make them feel welcome. You can announce their new positions via social media to your community or in your newsletter, and let your staff, volunteers, and donors know. For the orientation itself, it's important to stay organized. Make sure you have a new board welcome member packet so they can access everything they need to during the meeting. So if it's on a shared drive and you're doing a Zoom meeting, make sure they can access that before the meeting. Or if you're meeting in person, make sure it's printed out for them so they can, refer to these documents as you're going through it. This is not only an opportunity for new board members to get to know their fellow board members, it's really a way to understand how they're going to function within the board, as well as their role and responsibilities. And at NORD, again, we know so many of you are working with limited resources. And sometimes your entire board is made up of family members and close friends. Because it's really hard to feel like others want to invest in rare diseases because they're so rare. But this is an incredible moment to really shine, I think, and re-inspire not only your new board members, but re-inspire your current board members. So make sure you share your personal story of how the organization was developed, because storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool for activation and motivation. Your welcome package should also include a clear description of roles, expectations, your other board members' roles and their expectations as well, brief bios, contact info, your conflict of interest policy, bylaws, board member agreements, financial reports, and any other documents necessary. While you should give them everything they'll need, it's still important to keep orientation short so you're not overloading people with information. You can even break it up to make it more digestible as well. And to set the stage for open communications, make sure every new board member knows who they can go to ask questions, that all questions are welcome. And we know that board members are volunteering their time, they're volunteering their skills. So I'd encourage you to share what opportunities you may be able to provide for them as well to grow. So this can be through mentorship, access to resources or subscriptions you may have for professional development, or even networking events. So you can set up your new board member with a current board member as sort of a mentorship or buddy program so they can continue to build strong relationships in the board. Next slide, please. And I know Dr. Avent mentioned tokenism, and I wanted to take just a little bit of a deeper dive into this so we can really see what that looks like and feels like. It refers to including someone in a group for the sole purpose of meeting set goals or requirements or for the sake of appearing to be diverse. And this is the key, without being inclusive, without being inclusive. So the old saying was, and I think if you're in patient advocacy, you'll remember this, is that, we need a seat at the table. But we all know that's not enough, especially because of experiences with tokenism. It is a facade of progress. And for marginalized groups, we need a seat at the table and the equal opportunity to participate, voice concerns and opinions, and be included. So for example, I think this is becoming unfortunately quite common these days, but try not to pinhole new board members just to their identity. So for instance, you may enlist your new board member who's an Asian American woman to do your DEI work without even asking them, without considering whether they have the experiences to do the work, and without giving them the support they need to implement those initiatives. If they came onto the board with the intention of doing some DEI work, and broadening your organization's policies and efforts, that's wonderful. However, if they didn't, it's important to remember that your board members are more than just how they identify. They're people with developed professional skill sets, in addition to DEI, right, who can help you make progress if given the right environment. So this ties again, I think, back to organizational values and beliefs, which is why I really stress this in the beginning. Consider what is your support system and what's the space you've created for people to feel comfortable, fully utilizing their skills, asking questions, making suggestions, even challenging other voices when necessary. Consider what the power dynamics are at play and what could be done to create a more equitable space for open dialogue and to really show that you value and consider one another. If this space is not there, what happens with tokenism, if there's some bad apples in the group preventing people from really showing up authentically, then your efforts and resources used to diversify your board could likely be in vain. People belonging to marginalized groups can see through this facade easily. So whether you're a person of color, a person with a disability, or any combination of identities, you definitely know when your presence is just there as a token. And tokenism is at least equally, if not more harmful than not diversifying at all. It can cause real trauma to the person being tokenized, as they feel they're not viewed holistically and valued for what they can bring to the table or could have brought to the table. So rest assured, likely that person won't be able to stick around long in that environment. Next slide, please. So as you can continue to really think about how you can incorporate DEI policies and efforts in your board, I encourage you to think about how your organization functions overall as a whole. So if you have a support line for community members to call, who's on the other side of that phone? Have they been given the support and training to make people who may not be familiar with their organization yet comfortable? Are there language or cultural barriers? What languages are offered for translation, if any? As we learned in this entire DEI series, working towards one piece of the puzzle at a time is really the only way to effectively tackle and help close these gaps, because no one can do it all at once. At the same time, really consider keeping an eye on the big picture. If you have staff and volunteers, I encourage you to think about how the environment they operate in could be more diverse and inclusive, and how that could even expand the community you end up serving. When people who come into contact with the organization can see themselves in your staff and volunteers, that is truly powerful, and they're likely to stick around and become a part of your community. In the same manner, our volunteers who go above and beyond for you and for the community, are they being given opportunities to really take part in committees or grow within the organization? So to end this, I say all of this to just remind you that committing to strategies that integrate DEI should be a requirement for all your board members, leadership, staff, volunteers within your organization, not just those belonging to marginalized groups. This takes an entire village to help build trust, rebuild trust. It's a lifelong process where we all keep learning, and hopefully we're doing better each time we try. So thank you again so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Ashanti, and all of our panelists. If you would like to come back on camera, we're going to take questions from the audience. We had questions that were collected in the registration form. We also had questions from the audience and emails from our member organizations. So many questions, I don't even know where to start. All right, I'll start with one that is a little bit basic, but so there's 7,000 rare diseases, and 6,000 of them or so, it's an estimate, it's a ballpark, do not have a rare disease organization, a nonprofit representing them. And NORD has a program called Rare Launch, where we work with individuals who come to us and say, we want to start a nonprofit. Usually it's one family, maybe it's parents of a child or someone who's living with a rare disease, and they're rushing to find a cure. As they're starting up, they need to find other people in their community. How would you, and I'm going to start the video or ask to start the video for our panelists, how would you encourage someone who is just at ground zero starting a nonprofit to find and include diverse populations, considering that they may not realize they have an affinity bias?
I'm happy to help answer that, Debbie.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful place to start when you're at ground zero, and you can really infuse DEI into everything you're doing as you're growing. But I would encourage people to probably also first learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? What does that mean at the core, of those words? And learn about things like affinity bias. And I think for some of our rare disease leaders, as I said, most of them are patients themselves or their parents, their caregivers. Time is limited, resources are limited. But one thing you can do is to look outside of your traditional networks. I think sometimes we think only my family is going to care about this. Only my close friends are going to care about this. You know, it's so rare. No one else will really take an interest. But if you become well-versed in telling your story and your why you created the organization, what the need is, I think when you look into different avenues for bringing on board members, whether that's, you know, your LinkedIn community or even social media, things like Clubhouse, you will find that people will, I think, you know, be interested, and it's an easy sort of ask, you know, what to say that, you know, this is a rare disease, but this is how it's affecting people that we directly know in our community.
Thanks, Ashanti. I don't know if Yolanda or Walter have any response to that.
Yeah, I would just highlight again what Ashanti mentioned is really connecting with other community organizations is going to be a helpful step as well. So if you know like-minded community organizations that it may not be exactly what you do, but if there are different intersections in the community of people who are engaging in community organizing and in that work, that can be helpful to you in seeing where is a start. Look at the boards of other community organizations that are also like you, right? Review some of those boards, maybe ask to speak to the people who run those boards to see if they have recommendations for you, for people who could also maybe serve on your board or help in that capacity as well. So I encourage you, I know it's overwhelming because it's a lot of talking, but use your social media platforms, use, you know, LinkedIn and all of the other platforms, because oftentimes we think if we reach out to people, I've had people reach out to me on LinkedIn, and then I'm surprised that I respond. So yeah, I respond and people respond. So you have to try and you have to put yourself out there to do that.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add to what's been already presented is remember, you're dealing with a whole person, right? And so the individual may have a rare disease, but you know, they're part of other groups as well. They're human. And remember that humans tend to love one another and they even like each other from time to time. And so don't think that you have to find everybody who's like-minded or who are of a similar background, because there's a full person. Think about some of the people that you serve, even look in the mirror as someone who's advocating for this group, and think about what other groups, what other individuals, what other types of people you identify with, spend time with, because you're not just a single item, single issue. That would be my 2 cents.
That's really helpful. I think that is helpful, especially for rare diseases, because we know of some populations that have 10 patients or 4 patients. And those leaders or people starting up nonprofits in those spaces say, how do I get a board that's diverse when there's only 10 people affected by it? So thinking outside of that one identity, we can think back to our first webinar where we talked about intersectionality. People are multidimensional and their lives cut across through so many different areas. So I appreciate that. I think that's a helpful reminder. So I wanted to bring back one thing, which was, Walter, you had said that you appreciate transparency when you're being recruited and people say, we don't have an African-American on our board, or we don't have a person in your age cohort. That sounds like tokenism, if that's all they say. And so for our audience members, you know, it is important to be transparent, but they have to say more than that. What else would you suggest to make sure that they're avoiding tokenism while also balancing transparency?
So let's think about the psychology of language and the psychology of words. The word token has really gotten a bad rap, right? If you're referred to as a token, it's seen as a pejorative or a negative thing. So ask somebody when you're being transparent that I really need you to champion this particular group. I would like you to champion this population that's not part of our board. And if you think about what being a champion means versus being just someone who represents a group, it transitions you from even a perception of tokenism to, man, I'm really a champion. I'm here to be a winner for this group. And I think if we think about representation in that way, it helps us to go beyond, okay, we checked the box. Because if you're looking for a champion, you're not just looking for someone to check a box, you're looking for someone to be a hero, for someone to be a winner, for someone to drive a value that you don't have. So think about it in that regard. That's what I would suggest.
Yolanda and Nishanti, any feedback on that question?
Yeah, I would just only add again, really to Walter's statement is if you approach it as an investment, right, to this point, you're investing in the community. And so a vision for your investment, this is your investment as an organization. And so looking at the outcomes is that if we have people who can represent the community needs, right, it's going to further the vision for your investment in that community. So I think if you look at it as an organization, is how are we investing? This is one way that we're investing. But be clear and diversify your investment. You putting that one board member shouldn't be the only thing you're doing. It should be a part of your mission, and it should be an active part of your mission. So all of the board members can live that mission, not just the one person that you're putting on it. So I really encourage people to look at it as an investment and as a part of your vision in terms of how you're going to continue to invest in those communities and uplift them.
Thank you. Ashanti, any feedback on that?
I completely agree with Walter and Dr. Avent. I think, if you're bringing on board members who are, diverse and maybe not like the ones who currently look like on your board, I think if they're tied to diversifying the communities that you're serving or representing those communities, as long as they can see that, like Dr. Avent said, you're continuing to make other efforts as well to diversifying and making sure that it's everyone's responsibility, then I think you can easily avoid tokenism. It's not just being one person, like I'm a woman of color on a board that's all white, but if I see that efforts are being made to diversify at all levels, it feels less like the pressure is all on you, and that person will feel less like a token.
Yeah, just one more thing as well. I think it's important that we help people appreciate the value in being first, right? If we think about Jackie Robinson and we think about others, there's a great value in being first. And again, I really reflect as I've gotten older on certain words that we've used to identify people who are representatives of underrepresented groups, right? And the word, oh, they're just a token. And so now that creates a sense of dread for anyone else that might be first in the future, right? Because if you are perceived by the outside community as being a token, you don't see yourself as a champion, right? And so sometimes those of us that are part of underrepresented minorities have to be very careful on how we project some of our feelings on our members who are breaking barriers and representing us in places where we weren't represented before.
Thank you for that. That's a shift in perspective for sure. And yeah, if you're recruiting someone who is from a marginalized or underrepresented community and you're bringing them onto the board, you're not just bringing on, whatever that area is for representation, but the whole package. And so you want to consider what skills they're bringing in, what perspectives, what other affiliations. So it's not just, hey, Debbie, you're a Mexican American, you're a Chicana. We want you to come and speak on behalf of all Mexican Americans. Hey, Debbie, you actually have a sister with a rare disease. You live in the Southwest. You have experienced barrier access issues and discrimination. We know what your experiences are. And while you might not speak for all in your community, we want you to speak for your experience and help us better understand the community. So it's really not we're asking you to come and represent one massive population. It's bring your experience to the board as the first and help us continue to see differently. So I think that's really helpful because people want to do the right thing, and affinity bias and unconscious bias is real. And so I think just really going into detail about what does it actually look like to recruit someone and do it in a way that's thoughtful is to recruit the whole person and all of their skills and experiences, and avoid the pitfalls that can be attached with tokenism and that lack of being deliberate and understanding who you're asking and when you're bringing them on. So you invite someone, they say yes, they come to the board. One of the questions that we have is very specific. How do we make our board, who are primarily 40-ish white men less intimidating and more comfortable for new board members?
So I'll start. I think part of what you have to do is have conversations before you bring new board members on. And this is what I mean by being in the DNA of your organization. You don't just come in cold, right? You have to have conversations. Be very clear about where your biases lie as an organization. The goal is not to bring someone in and then to hide all of the things that have happened. If you've had controversy, be very clear so that people know what they're coming into. But I think having implicit bias is something that we all have, and being aware of that. So identify where your bias lies so that you know when conflict comes up, do you have a communication plan around conflict for board members? Don't set people up where some people are going to naturally be closer to others on the board. But what is going to be your communication plan? Do you have guidelines for engagement around difficult conversations? One that we use is, wait, why am I talking, right? Why am I not talking? So thinking about instituting guidelines for conversation and when conflict comes. But I would just say, be very clear about where your biases lie as an organization, get training, have these open conversations. So when these things come up, it's not, again, just the elephant in the room and no one talks about them, or these group think starts to set in and then people don't have the conversations, because silence is going to tell a story as well. So that would be my recommendation, is get the implicit bias training, do the conversations, and be intentional about putting things in writing as well.
I really love Dr. Avon's statement about understand the DNA of your organization. You really have to understand that, because within the organization, there's going to have to be at least one champion, and I'm big on that word today for some reason, who's going to break away from the group, from the commonality, or bring the group with him or her to engage the diverse candidate, right? And I think that's really important. Again, and maybe because it's, you know, been a Netflix and chill season for 18 months, not that we've been chilling, but I think again about the Jackie Robinson story, right? And I'm also participating in another virtual conference at the same time. And someone made a reference to Jackie Robinson. They said, you know, one reason why he was the first was not because he was the best or had the most skills, but he had the right compartment, the right makeup to be in a situation. There's a great scene from the film, and the guy who's on the team says, because I know you're not going, because you can't respond, I need you to be able to endure. And I'm probably paraphrasing it incorrectly. And I think that while that might be an extreme example, it does suggest that we have to be so thoughtful and forward thinking when we want to diversify our board. It's work. And the work begins at home with us and then spreads out to who we look to recruit, and how we help those individuals respond and have an active role in our organizations.
Thank you. Ashanti, do you want to take us out with a last response to that question, or just an overall response in our last 2 minutes?
Sure. I, again, completely agree with Walter and Dr. Avent. It definitely starts with, again, looking at your values, right, as an organization. And, you know, if you don't have a statement in writing about your values, create one. And that creates discussion, right, when you're doing that, because that's a collaborative effort. And that is a really nice way to get started talking about, you know, if one of your values is respect, well, what does that mean, right? How do you show that? How can you show up for people? How are you making sure people are included? So it's a way to just talk about these things. And, you know, you can even give scenarios. And as you're thinking about diversifying your board, you know, if we brought on someone, what is the best way we would do this to demonstrate our values to them so they can see it? And it's not just in writing as well. But again, I agree that it has to be something sort of that you do beforehand, before you start looking into avenues, you know, to recruit.
Thank you, Ashanti. That's all the time that we have, but there was the inevitable question about the recording for this webinar. And if you're watching it live, the recording will be made available via email to registrants and then later promoted to our community. Thank you so much to Yolanda, Ashanti, and Walter for your incredible contributions during this last webinar in our series. By the end of this year, you will have gotten notification of a toolkit that accompanies all of these webinar recordings. The toolkit takes a much deeper dive. It has reflections, graphics and charts, more information and links that will help you, your board of directors, your staff, and your leadership team, and your grassroots advocates, and your medical professionals and industry, anyone who wants to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility in nonprofit governance and in rare diseases specifically, will be able to have access to the online toolkit. So there will be more coming in store for you. If you are not a member of the National Organization for Rare Disorders as a nonprofit organization, please email membership@rarediseases.org to learn more, because we have a lot more resources that can help you, including templates for other elements of governance and capacity, like growing your board of directors, conflict of interest, and even sample bylaws if you're starting up. Thanks again to our panelists and all of you for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your year, safe, and thanks so much. Bye, everybody.